Star Wars The Last Jedi is finally here. The film has done exceptionally well at the box office, which is no surprise. The critics love it, it's sitting at a pretty 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, but the fans are mixed, to say the least. The Last Jedi is still very much a visual masterpiece, but the inner workings of the story and how some characters play out has not been so stunning. I personally thoroughly enjoyed the film, but these things the fans haven't been too keen on, I agree with entirely. This is the most polarising Star Wars film ever, if not the most polarising film of 2017. Critics praise, fans pan. Even though it's a film series with some of the most dedicated fans in existence, even they can't leap across the gaping problems The Last Jedi have brought to the table. I'm Rich from Whatculture, and this is what the fans hated about Star Wars The Last Jedi. I'm sure I won't need to tell you this, but large spoilers ahead. Massive spoilers ahead. Don't say I didn't warn you. Luke as a character. From tossing his lightsaber aside to almost slaughtering his nephew in his sleep, Luke's role in The Last Jedi is inconsistent with what we know, to say the least. Mark Hamill himself has repeatedly said that he fundamentally disagreed with everything Rian Johnson had in mind for the character, even going so far as to say that he couldn't believe the director's take on how Luke would be post-Return of the Jedi. It's not hard to see what Hamill was referring to either, as many fans simply can't accept the wholesome hero who once saw the light in Darth Vader, a guy who is literally one of the most feared figures in the galaxy, would then resort to violence in a moment of conflict. Remember, this is his best friend and sister's child. It's a stretch to think he'd kill a random student, never mind a relative, and someone who, had he gone through with this, would have broken almost every meaningful relationship he'd ever built. Captain Phasma being wasted again. After being one of the most disappointing characters in Episode 7 considering how much she was built up, we were told Captain Phasma would have a much bigger role in The Last Jedi. That literally wasn't the case, as instead Gwendolyn Christie's potential-filled stormtrooper appears for what feels like only a few minutes of screen time. As a result, many were left deflated by such a lackluster appearance, leaving many comments online as to what was even the point of having her return at all. Thankfully, Phasma still has a fairly memorable fight with Finn, struck down to reveal Christie's eye underneath that helmet, only to tumble into a pit of fire, potentially killing off the character for good. With Phasma being the creation of J.J. Abrams in the first place, it's back over to him to see if she reappears in Episode 9. The comedy just wasn't Star Wars. It's very hard to nail down precisely what Star Wars comedy is, but in the past, it's never been something that fundamentally alters the tone of an ongoing scene. If a specific scene is to be taken seriously, then it plays out. Yes, we've had everything from Muppet-based shenanigans involving Yoda and Chewie's flailing arms to even the Ewoks derailing Return of the Jedi for 20 minutes, but at no point did you feel like you were watching a parody of the source material itself. As many fans have pointed out, things like the opening exchange between Hux and Poe feels more like a Saturday Night Live sketch, and it's this level of forced humour that tends to come in either at the middle of or directly after any meaningful moment. Kylo and Rey talking through the Force for the first time, cut to a band of humorously dressed aliens cleaning up in the background. Rey about to start her training, have her forget that she already knows how the Force works and reach out, literally using her arm. The Last Jedi's comedic beats certainly hit home with mainstream audiences and those not taking every new morsel of new information seriously, but for those who like their Star Wars to resonate without poking fun at itself, like, Star Wars fans, this was a major, consistent disconnect. Snoke's complete lack of backstory. Another example of Rian Johnson wanting to make Episode 8 his own, one of the biggest casualties of this wipe the slate clean mentality was Snoke. The only problem with this is fans had spent 2 solid years debating and theorising over who this guy was. The music in the background of his introduction was the same as the scene in Episode 3, maybe he was Darth Plagueis the Wise. His age and assumed power puts him in an active state around the time of any previous movie, yet we'd never even heard of him. Why was that? What was Snoke's backstory? How did he fund the First Order? How did he find Kylo Ren and turn him to the dark side? We find none of this out in The Last Jedi because Kylo slices him in half, and even if Episode 9 resurrects a ton of potential plot points, that's still 2 years away. Rey's parent reveal. Second to Snoke's history, on the list of ongoing theories was Rey's parents, another major talking point that, again, was teased heavily across The Force Awakens. We see Rey being mysteriously left by a ship supposedly containing her parents. She mentions them a couple of times, and JJ even shot an entire sequence where a Force vision shows Rey walking the same path as Luke Skywalker on Cloud City, as Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda whisper in her ear about this being her first steps. Luke's iconic theme even flares in the background when she grabs the blue lightsaber to fight Kylo Ren. It's safe to say these were major teasers to an eventual reveal. Sadly, all of that potential is discarded when Rey's parents are said to be nobodies, randoms who traded her for money and left her on Jakku as a slave. While the idea of coming from nothing and making your mark on the galaxy is very Star Wars, once again this was 2 years worth of theorizing cast aside for another unsatisfying subversion of expectation. How did Maz get Luke's lightsaber? Talk about your "and we'll get around to this later" plot teasers. Maz literally tells the audience that her acquisition of Luke's lightsaber, last seen falling to the depths of Cloud City no less, is a story for another time. That time would come in The Force Awakens visual dictionary, as we find out Maz actually sought out the saber after deciding to reactivate her Force powers following the death of Emperor Palpatine. However, is that anywhere in the movie? Is it anywhere other than a completely optional book that references this in a couple of sentences? Hell no. And that's besides the fact that even Luke, who again hasn't seen the saber in 30 years, doesn't even inquire as to how Rey got it. The Knights of Ren are forgotten. Initially mentioned by Snoke in The Force Awakens and even seen by Rey in her vision, the Knights of Ren are nowhere to be seen in The Last Jedi, much to the chagrin of Kylo fans. Weirdly, Ren actually mentions them in one of his dialogue excerpts in Star Wars Battlefront 2, stating "the Knights of Ren come for you," confirming that they did exist in the canon and weren't just a throwaway creation on behalf of JJ Abrams. Still, the nearest thing we get in the new film is Luke mentioning that he had other students that left after Kylo's uprising, but are these the Knights of Ren? Lair Poppins. Rian Johnson has repeatedly stated that despite Carrie Fisher passing away during filming, her role did not change. So, with that in mind, was the dumbfounding Leia flies through space recovery scene always in the script? Let's be clear, Leia using the Force on paper is a damn cool thing. We've known she was Force sensitive since hearing Luke's thoughts in Empire Strikes Back, but to showcase something more visual in this way has split the fanbase right down the middle. On one hand, Leia is literally shown to be this almost angelic figure, elegantly gliding back to her ship in one epically scored motion. On the other, it just looked terrible. Many theatres have reportedly laughed when the camera cuts to the wider angle showing a Leia in motion that's more reminiscent of Superman than anything that belongs in Star Wars. Luke's weightless death. Here's a question: what actually killed Luke Skywalker? Was it pulling off a Force projection? Was it taking all of those laser blasts by proxy of some damage still being felt? Was it old age, sacrificing himself to become one with the Force, or maybe a bit too much of that green milk? Take your pick, because the movie leaves his death more just as something that happens after the climactic battle. Fans have lamented how Luke goes from misguided old man to not even taking part in the final fight, ultimately dying due to reasons that in retrospect don't add up. Though he literally becomes a new symbol of peace and hope across the galaxy, the reality is that many audiences simply didn't get why Luke had to die at all. Going forward, regardless of how you feel, we all have to live in a reality where one of the most popular characters in sci-fi history didn't get a more beloved send-off. And finally, everything relating to the Finn and Rose plotline. At some point, the Lucasfilm brain trust behind Star Wars will have to revisit not only the iconography and time period of the prequels, but the humour and more creature-filled nature of the locations too. To its credit, The Last Jedi tries to have its prequel cake and eat it, devoting an entire casino setting and chase sequence to a mentality that feels decidedly prequel-y. Sadly, the plot elements behind this just aren't propulsive or believable enough for the sequence to land, and you'll be struggling to find anyone online who actually enjoyed this part of the film, let alone the forced chemistry between Finn and Rose. It grinds the film to a halt every time we cut back to these scenes, with the stranded Poe on the ship as he waits on what to do next, and in the end, nothing accomplished here factors into the finale on Crate. And there we have it. They're the things the fans hated about Star Wars The Last Jedi. But what do you think? Is The Last Jedi the best film in the Star Wars saga, or is the prequel trilogy looking a little more inviting after this outing? Of course, let us know in the comments section below. Even more Star Wars The Last Jedi content is over on Whatculture.com, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. I'm Rich from Whatculture, and I'll see you soon.